So greetings to everyone who's watching, and perhaps before we begin, it is most appropriate for me that I should begin by thanking most profoundly the EFF for according us this opportunity to have a conversation as Black people about a subject, as pertinent today as decolonization. I think that it is an initiative that must be commended. So I do thank most sincerely the political education desk of the EFF, led by Commissar Ndlozi, for this opportunity for us as Black people to have this conversation. Of course, it's a conversation that we are holding amidst a serious world crisis, where the world is faced by the pandemic or the plague, so to say, coronavirus. And of course, we can't emphasize enough the necessity for everyone to take the necessary precautionary measures that would enable us survive and meet on the other side, of this pandemic. Well, I do, unlike many other people, as I'm going to try show why later on, have a difficulty in urging you to comply with, the measures that have been put in place, that are suggested. What I do think I'm capable of doing is actually dispel what is becoming a political mantra, from the political elite in South Africa, but also, from elsewhere, suggesting that, the country post, corona would be a different world. We hear that, post the coronavirus, South Africa cannot be the same society again. It's nothing. The world will be the same again. In 1918, the world was faced with what became known as the Spanish Influenza. 50 million people perished. Barely a generation later, the world had forgotten. It continued, as though, as though nothing had happened. Why? The reason is because what did not change was the modern consciousness and its metaphysic, which is the supposition that by the Western world that the world is always available for domestication in order to advance, unlimited economic interests. And so for the Western consciousness, for people who are possessed, of the modern ontology of the social, the world must always be available, for domestication by human beings, not just for domestication, for exploitation in order to advance their unlimited economic interests. That consciousness did not end or change as a result of the Spanish influenza. You can already see the same thing in South Africa, that the white modern consciousness or the white modern ontology of the social still supposes that the world always existed the pleasure of human beings who have the ability always to domesticate it in order to advance their economic interests. Preservation of life is secondary to that. In fact, everything else becomes secondary in this modern consciousness to the advancement of economic interest. Have we not seen it in South Africa today? The determination by the white people to continue operating an economy that killed us in any way. An economy that kills us in any way as Black people, but they insist that that is what has to take precedent over the preservation of life. But what these pandemics teach us is the fact that diseases don't change the world. What they teach us is the fact that we have a responsibility to take conscious and active steps in order to change the world. So the steps that we needed to take in order to change South Africa prior to the coronavirus are precisely the same steps that we need to take. What the coronavirus is going to do is going to bring even to the face of those who were denying the fact or the reality that as Black people, we exist in this country as non-beings, as people who exist outside of the category human. So I think that, we must, as we strive to survive the virus, not think that now we have been absolved of our social responsibility to make the South African society less racist or to make it a less anti-black society. That responsibility still behooves on us. The fact that it is more black people who are going to die out of this coronavirus is a statement of that social responsibility that we have. Now, that said, I think that it is appropriate for me to begin by saying that soon we are going to see that my exposition on this subject, and perhaps maybe I should state what the theme that guides and disciplines our engagement today is. So the title of this lecture is Decolonization, a History of the Concept. Now, as I trace the genealogy of the concept of decolonization, one of the things that is going to become very noticeable is that I begin this genealogy from the 1900s onwards. Now, any good student of history would at that point ask a very pertinent question, which is, why is it that I begin, from the 1900s when there is a good example of a decolonization process that happens prior to the 1900s? So I must say a little about that, example. And that example comes to us from Haiti. So in 1804, the slaves in Haiti won a war of decolonization against their masters and defeated their white settler masters and gained their independence. And so in 1804, led by Toussaint, they declared the Republic of Haiti. Now, here is the important lesson of that, example at decolonization. It is that these were slaves. These were people who all their lives had labored as slaves. They had had very little exposure to the rest of the world. They had had no education whatsoever. But if you look at the level of imagination that they displayed, in response to the problems they were confronted with, it puts to shame the level of creativity and the level of imagination and the level of thinking that is displayed by the nationalist elite that led South Africa to independence. And so, if you think about it, here are slaves with no education whatsoever, who at the point when they win independence, they have to declare a republic, but then they have no education. But they had to write a new constitution. They could not appeal, to any experience prior to them, because by 1804, the world hadn't known, not much of the world, had known the new notions of Republican constitutionalism. And so they were trailblazing. But there was something even more in their experiment at decolonization. It is that when they had to draft the Constitution of the Republic, in that Constitution they included an important clause, which was that Haiti was a black republic, meaning that every black person anywhere in the world was a citizen of Haiti. All that you needed was to be black, and you had a republic that was waiting for you to welcome you as a citizen in Haiti. Now, this is important because by 1804, there are several other, slave, holdings across the Caribbean, the islands and the archipelago. There are several other slave holdings or islands that are still under colonial slavery. Now, the fact that Haiti had declared that every black person is a citizen of the Republic of Haiti, which means that Haiti became a black republic, not because of the predominance in the demography of Haiti of black people, but by the fact that any black person anywhere in the world was a citizen of Haiti. So the slaves in the other Caribbean islands got wind of this declaration in Haiti. And so it is that it became their habit that they would in the night steal the boats of their masters and sail from the different islands to Haiti, get onto the shore in Haiti, leave the boats of their masters, and then become citizens. So they would gain their freedom, and suddenly, yesterday they were slaves, they wake up, once they get onto the shore in Haiti, they become citizens, they gain their freedom. Of course, this irritated, the white settlers who owned the other as colonies, the other Caribbean islands, because it meant that it was disrupting, the settler colonial economy of these other islands, which was built on slavery. Because now suddenly slaves could desert, get to Haiti and become citizens. But that was not just what irritated, the Western world about Haiti as an example of decolonization. It is the fact that when these masters from the other Caribbean islands will get to the shore of Haiti and indeed find evidence that their slaves must be here, because they would see their boats that the slaves would have stolen in the night and used to sail to, Haiti. Once they recognize their boats, they would then declare to the political leadership in Haiti that, well, we have come here because our slaves are here, and here is the evidence. Our boats are here. And this is what Toussaint and the political leadership, and this is where you see the level of imagination of slaves that far surpasses that of an educated nationalist elite in South Africa. And here is what they would say in response to the masters. They would say, oh, well, that's very unfortunate that your slaves had done that, but the people we are talking about are our citizens. Well, you can have your boats and leave. The people you can't have because they are our citizens. Now, that was the cardinal sin that Haiti ever committed in the eyes of the Western world. That is why it remains until today very much hated by the Western world. And so, for those of us, who remember this history, there is something that becomes very easy to explain if we recall this history. Many of you would remember the gesture that the former president of South Africa, Thabo Mbeki, extended to the then president or prime minister of Haiti, Jean Aristide. Now, I do not claim to speak, for the former president. I do not know what his motivations were, in extending that gesture. But it became significant to us for this reason. It is that when Aristide had been ousted in Haiti by the Western world, America particularly, the South African government, led by the then president of Thabo Mbeki, extended to him, a gesture, allowed him to come live in South Africa, extended to him all the privileges that, you would extend to a person of his stature. Why did South Africa go to that extent? In fact, you would remember well, if you go to the archives, that white people at the time raised all the ire about the waste of, state resources and whatnot. What they hid in their protestation was the fact that Aristide and Haiti represented a definitive attempt, to decolonize. And so how could you celebrate and protect someone who represented, or whose society and history represented that definitive example where black struggles win over, white settler colonizers? But be that as it may, that gesture, what the president did was actually a gesture reciprocating, that world historical development that Haiti, had given to us. So it was a good gesture reciprocating a historical lesson or a historical gift, that Haiti had given to the black world. So that said, I do, want to put this example of decolonization, outside of my, scope, but I do so with the hope that, in these continuing conversations that, the Political Education Desk has organized, we will at some point have a session, I was told, will at a point have a session, on Haiti. What Haiti represents, what the Haitian Revolution represents in the struggles of black people. So I bracket it because on its own, it's so complex in its lessons, and it's so enduring in what it offers, in our understanding today, such that it is deserving of an engagement, on its own. So I'm going to, that said, begin my own exposition of the history or the genealogy of decolonization, or the concept of decolonization. I'm going to begin from the 1900s. And what structures, there are two texts that I think that help us begin, this history of the concept of decolonization. Many of you will perhaps have heard, in these sessions that the EFF has been organizing, of a text by Lenin titled, Imperialism, the Highest Stage of Capitalism. I want to suggest to you that actually there is a text that presages that one. There is a text that precedes that one that actually had a very big influence on Lenin. This was a text by J.A. Hobson. It's published in 1902. The title is Imperialism, a Study. Now, this is a very important, text that actually would influence, Lenin, as I said, who wrote his Imperialism, the Highest Stage of Capitalism, much later. Hobson wrote this in 1902, Imperialism, a Study. So, here's the point. In the first half of the 1900s, there are two studies that actually influenced the way in which we thought about decolonization. These two studies is, as I've said, one by, Hobson, titled Imperialism, a Study, which had a very major influence on, Lenin later on in his Imperialism, the Highest Stage of Capitalism. Now, what was the claim, or what were the claims, made by these two studies, and how did these claims influence the way in which we thought about decolonization at the time? Both Hobson and, for the purposes of this discussion, I'm going to focus on what is similar between Hobson and Lenin. They do differ on little finer details, but by and large, they agree on the fundamentals of the argument. And what are the fundamentals of the argument? It is that capital in Europe had reached a saturation point. And so it was in need of new avenues because it had reached the diminishing rates of returns. So the rate of returns for capital in Europe were no longer increasing, but rather, were stagnating or they were diminishing. And so capital was in need of new or virgin avenues where it could still increase its rates of return. And so colonialism basically becomes a necessary step in that outward spread of capital from Europe in search of new grounds or virgin markets, so to say, wherein it could still maximize its returns. In the language of today, basically colonialism becomes a necessary step as capital is looking for fresh markets, where it can still increase its profitability. And so colonialism, becomes understandable as part of the global capital's movement. Because we now know, from much more insightful, studies on readings of the history of globalization that it's not a very recent phenomenon. Capital became global long before, the past, 50 years. It became global centuries ago. But the point is that both Hobson and Lenin agreed that colonialism was nothing but a mechanism, basically, to open up new markets for a capital, basically, that was in need of new avenues, and so this capital needed new avenues to export itself outside of Europe, to the rest of the world. And so colonialism opens up, the door to that outward expansion of capital, from Europe to the rest of the world. So in a sense, if you think in Hegelian, terms, what, colonialism was basically nothing but an outward, movement of the spirit. Spirit, in this case, you can think of it as capital. It was an outward movement of the spirit in search, of itself, so that it could return unto itself complete. So this was the fundamental point that both these studies made that would influence most, liberation movements at the time in the continent. But also this is the understanding of colonialism that would influence how the idea of decolonization itself, was, thought about and spoken of. What it had done basically is that the dominance of these two texts was that they had basically reduced colonialism into an economic imperative. Colonialism became understood as nothing more, nothing less than an economic imperative. The need for new markets in order to increase the profitability of capital. Indeed, in South Africa, this analysis was taken up by what was then known as the Communist Party of South Africa. And so it led to a very curious, development in the colonies, and particularly in South Africa. It led to a very curious development where you had a Communist Party of South Africa that was a racist organization that excluded black people, but thought of itself as being against imperialism, invariably as being against colonialism. Now, they couldn't see the contradiction of their point of themselves and their ideology, because they had taken, or they had accepted wholesale the idea that, colonialism was understandable as nothing but imperialism. The primary contradiction within colonialism was nothing but an economic contradiction. You had, the basic relations between exploitative classes and the exploited classes, and the response needed to be of the exploited classes, fighting against the exploiting classes, or the dominant class, or the bourgeois. And so you have a Communist Party of South Africa that, is racially exclusive, that excludes black people, but thinks of itself as fighting imperialism and fighting invariably colonialism. Because, as we've said, again, for them, colonialism was nothing but an economic imperative. And so all you needed to deal with, was the economic contradictions between the owners of the means of production, the bourgeois, and the working class. Now, this Communist Party of South Africa that included the workers did not see that in relation to black people, it was in a kind of a relation that suggested something else than economic relations. It couldn't see that, or it elected not to see that, because it had at its hands, or it had, within its reach, a theoretical handle that said that there was nothing racial about what was going on in South Africa. So the understanding, the economic reductionism of Hobson and Lenin basically occluded from view the racial elements of, capitalism in South Africa, So this is the dominant paradigm, in South Africa and in other colonies, and it continues to be dominant, and increasingly so when the Soviet Union begins to support actively liberation movements in the continent and in South Africa. And so 1900s, early 1900s, 1920s, 1930s, this is the dominant paradigm. This is how we think about imperialism and therefore colonization. and decolonization. Decolonization would simply mean undoing the contradictions of, capitalism, or of undoing the contradictions of imperialism, which is the highest stage of capitalism. Now, this, as I've said, is the dominant understanding of what colonialism is up until, the 1940s. There is a realization, a beginning of a realization by the 1940s that maybe something was not adequate or something was amiss, in this characterization or thinking about decolonization, where it was just nothing but, where colonialism was nothing but an economic imperative. Now, this realization in South Africa did not quite ferment into a strong theoretical conception of what decolonization is. That ferment happens outside of South Africa. It happens in North Africa. So there is a group of scholars in the 1950s, beginning from the late 40s, 1950s, who are based largely in North Africa, and have a relationship with France, because Algeria, and, the other North African countries where these scholars were based, were French colonies. Now, there is a group of scholars that are based, in North Africa that in the 1940s, 1950s begin to question the adequacy of this characterization or conceptualization or theorization of colonialism as nothing but motivated by economic needs. Now, in order for us to be able to make sense of this new emerging, theorization, or rather of this, disagreement that was able to cohere into a very strong school and to a very strong idea of decolonization, we have to, begin elsewhere. But maybe before we get there, it will help to mention a number of scholars that, were part of this, movement in North Africa. Now, often, when this school of thought is thought about or spoken about, we remember Fanon. But Fanon was part of a much larger group that included scholars like Albert Memmi. Now, Albert Memmi wrote, a number of important texts, three of which I'm going to mention because they are very useful. One of them is titled The Colonizer and the Colonized. The other is titled The Pillar of Salt, which is his biography. And the other is titled Racism. Now, these are very important texts, and Albert Memmi is one of the key members of this North African school of thought, North African-based school of thought, that challenges the Marxian understanding, the straight Marxian understanding of what colonialism was. Fanon, of course, was a member of this school of thought. In France, there is Sartre, Jean-Paul Sartre, who's also a key interlocutor, with these scholars who are based, in North Africa. And other than his major philosophical work, there are a few works that I think that were very influential in the emerging of this new conception of what colonialism is, that I'm going to explain in a moment. Now, Sartre wrote an existential novel titled Nausea around this time. So it's one of the very important texts that help us understand, what is this new conception of colonialism that emerges. It's a novel, existential novel, titled Nausea. But other than that, he had published in 1950 an article, titled Colonialism is a System. Now, this he published in 1950 in a journal or a newspaper titled, Temps Moderns, Modern Times. In fact, I'm wrong. He publishes this, I remember now, in 1956. It's titled Colonialism is a System. In a moment, we'll read, from these texts. Now, there were several other scholars that I do not need to, bog you about, who, are in this conversation in the 1960s, based in North Africa and in France. Except to mention that this is precisely around the same time that a new movement called negritude, it had already begun by the 1930s, but it was almost at its theoretical peak. And so it was part of the contributing factor to this new conceptualization of what colonialism is. So I said Sartre wrote Nausea, which is an existential novel. He wrote this article titled Colonialism is a System. Now, the third piece of work that he writes is titled The Black Orpheus. Now, The Black Orpheus is proof enough of the role that negritude plays in the development of this new school of thought. We have said enough. But what this school of thought taught us, and a point that I want to emphasize, is that decolonization does not stand in an asymmetrical or in a sequential relationship with colonialism. We have often assumed that decolonization is what follows colonialism. Decolonization is itself entailed within colonialism. Colonialism itself assumes decolonization. So decolonization is an integral or internal element, necessary element of colonization. It is, for those who are familiar with the Hegelian vocabulary, it is its own inner negation, which means that within colonialism, within oppression, is entailed the idea of freedom. Oppression itself does not make sense without the idea of freedom. And so it is the same thing. Colonization does not make sense without the idea of decolonization. So decolonization exists within colonialism as its own inner negation. Which means that decolonization entails within itself elements of its own undoing. But because it preempts those elements of its own undoing, to undo colonialism then requires something more. So this is where we require a different understanding of decolonization that is given to us by this school of thought. Because, as we have said, if decolonization is colonialism's inner negation, its own self-relating negativity, it means that colonialism already preempts moves towards decolonization. And because it preempts them, it then integrates them into its own logic, meaning that it mutes its effects. And so there are struggles of decolonization that lead to nothing. You know why they lead to nothing? It is because they failed in counting the negativity more than twice. Now, I know that that's not a good way of putting it, but we'll explain in a moment. So, the idea of nothingness only makes sense if you begin from what are the elements of a being. The idea of oppression makes sense only if you have an idea of freedom. And so when you oppress people, already in that oppression, you are suggesting to them an idea of freedom, because you are saying to them, I'm depriving you freedom. To dominate you, I'm depriving you of freedom, I'm negating your freedom. But because colonization preempts decolonization, it is its own negativity. Decolonization is its own negativity. As I've said, there are struggles of decolonization that mean nothing or that lead to nothing because they are already preempted by colonialism itself. So what would then amount to a proper struggle for decolonization? Zizek helps us in this regard, because Zizek is one of the few, readers of Hegel who suggest to us that, wait a moment, those of you who talk about, the dialectic and talk about the negativity that is entailed in any positive miss the point, because what you do when you want to negate decolonialism, you negate it once, meaning that when you negate that aspect of decolonization, or rather that aspect of colonialism that it is already anticipating itself, what you are doing is you are negating a negation already, because colonialism already has its own self-relating negativity, its own negation, which is decolonization. But then if you come to negate colonialism, to fight colonialism, you are going to meet already within colonialism an element of it that negates it. But then what we are doing is that we are bringing two negatives. It's a negative, it's a negation of a negation. What happens in that regard is that if you bring two negative, a negation of a negation, the outcome is a positive, it's an affirmation. So many of the struggles towards decolonization in Africa, they have simply failed to count the dialectic or the negativity appropriately. Now, that's at a theoretical level. At a level of praxis, it means that, as we are going to see Sartre say, is that there is a supposition that colonialism could be reformed. Sartre says you cannot reform colonialism, it's a system. And once you try to reform it, it would integrate you into its own logic. That is what Hegel calls supersession, or that's what he in other times calls transcoding. But the meaning here is simply that if you try to reform it, it's going to integrate your logic into it. So its structure is not going to change. It's going to say, oh, you want more black people, you want BEE. It's fine, would integrate, some of them, but the structure of the economy doesn't change. That is what we call failing to count the negation appropriately. You're basically coming to negate a negation, and that in the process you affirm the structure, because when you've integrated the few black people via BEE, they then become defenders of a colonial economy that they did not construct. Because in any case, it was invariable. They were a negative added to a negative, which must give us an affirmation, a positive. So this was the thinking that actually influenced many of these scholars who were based in North Africa and who had a conversation with people, back in France. And I've said that amongst the key interlocutors of that new school of thought that came to challenge the Hobson and Lenin's, exposition were people like Fanon, people like Albert Memmi, people like Sartre, and people, who were part of the Negritude movement, Leon Damas, and other people like Leopold Sedar Senghor. Now, what was the new conception of decolonization that, this class gave to us? Albert Memmi and Sartre, who the two of these members of the school that I'm going to focus on, are very useful. And before I go on to elaborate what was the new conception of decolonization that they gave to us, I want to read to you what Albert Memmi says in the preface of the book, The Colonizer and the Colonized. Indulge me as I read, briefly what, Albert Memmi says in the preface of The Colonizer and the Colonized. This is in the preface, and this is what he writes. I have been criticized for not having constructed my portrait entirely around economic structure. But I feel I have repeated often enough that the idea of privilege is at the heart of the colonial relationship, and that privilege is undoubtedly economic. Let me take this opportunity to reaffirm my position. For me, the economic aspect of colonialism is fundamental. The book itself opens with a denunciation of the so-called moral or cultural mission of colonization and shows that the profit motive is its basic. I have often noted that the deprivations of the colonized are the almost direct result of the advantages secured to the colonizer. I must repeat that. I have often noted that the deprivations of the colonized are the almost direct result of the advantages secured to the colonizer. To observe the life of the colonizer and the colonized is to discover rapidly that the daily humiliation of the colonized, his objective subjugation, are not merely economic. And again, I must repeat that. To observe the life of the colonizer and the colonized is to discover rapidly that the daily humiliation of the colonized, his objective subjugation, are not merely economic. Even the poorest colonizer thought himself to be and actually was superior to the colonized. This too was part of colonial privilege. The Marxist discovery of the importance of the economy in all oppressive relationships is not to the point. And I must repeat again that the Marxist discovery of the importance of the economy in all oppressive relationships is not to the point. This relationship has other characteristics which I believe I have discovered in the colonial relationship. But one might ask in the final analysis, don't these phenomena have a more or less hidden economic aspect? Isn't the motivating force of colonization economic? The answer is maybe, not certainly. We don't actually know what man is or just what is essential to him, whether it is money, sex, or pride. Does psychoanalysis win over Marxism? Does all depend on the individual or on society? In any case, before attacking this final analysis, I wanted to show all the real complexities in the lives of the colonizer and the colonized. Psychoanalysis or Marxism must not, under the pretext of having discovered the source or one of the main sources of human conduct, preempt all experience, all feeling, all suffering, and all the byways of human behavior, and call them profit motive or the Oedipus complex. Very clear. Very clear. What Albert Memmi basically is suggesting to us is that, one, we know that indeed privilege is economic or expresses itself in material terms. But as he says, maybe privilege also has, other forms. It may be symbolic, it may be cultural. And there is nothing that makes the other more important or determinant over the other. Because as he says, he found, and there's something interesting about Albert Memmi himself. Albert Memmi is a white Jew who comes from very poor background in France, but gets to Tunisia and becomes a white settler and all of a sudden privileged. So he discovers that his privilege was not founded on economics. He discovered that his privilege was founded on his race because he had come from France being poor, but gets to Tunisia and suddenly is privileged, is superior. So here's the point that Albert Memmi is making. It is that a poor white settler, look around in South Africa if you don't understand this, a poor white settler knows that he or she is superior to a rich black person. And he says he was actually superior. He didn't only imagine himself superior or herself superior. in actuality he or she was superior. And so this is why suddenly Memi turns around and says, well, maybe the economy was the real motivation for colonialism, but it was not the only one. Why? Because he says we don't know man's motivation. It might be that it was not money that motivated him to leave Europe and come to Africa. It may have been sex. Of course, we know that a large part of Europeans who left Europe and came to Africa were on a sexual adventure. It was their desire to satisfy, or it was their intent to satisfy their libidinal desires, on the African, because of course the African had been assumed to possess, extraordinary sexual capabilities. And so many of them who left Europe, of course we know were sexual perverts, were alcoholics, and, social misfits. Many of them came to the continent not because of the economy. Many of them came to the continent to satisfy their libidinal desires. So colonialism was equally a sexual adventure. And this Albert Memmi is able to recognize, because North Africa, just like South Africa, you would remember, was a settler colony. Many North African colonies were settler colonies, just like South Africa. Now, if you look in all settler colonies, the evidence for the fact that sex was a huge motivating factor for colonialism is in the miscegenation. It's in the mulatto or colored population that results, from colonialism. If indeed sex was not part of the whole colonial adventure, how do we explain the white person's obsession with the black prostitute today? So Albert Memmi suggests to us that we may have to look elsewhere. And here is the important point that Albert Memmi makes. He says, neither Marxism nor psychoanalysis, which is what he wants to do, neither Marxism nor psychoanalysis must preempt other explanations for colonialism. Colonialism had other sources and other reasons other than just economic reasons. It was not just motivated by profit. It was motivated by sex. It was motivated, by other things, as Albert Memmi, points to us. And so what he's pleading for is a plurality of causality, or a plurality of cause. So we must not, emphatically say it is the economic contradiction that was responsible for colonialism. There is a much more useful way of thinking about this that actually comes to us, from Marxist analysis, which begins to think about primary and secondary contradictions. But it doesn't end at primary and secondary contradictions. It also tells us about a primary contradiction, or rather a secondary contradiction of a primary contradiction. Or, if you think in Althusserian terms, it is best to think of overdetermination, where, the economic overdetermines and is overdetermined by other motivations. This was the major contribution of this North African school. It began to say that colonialism has other motivations. Privilege does not express itself merely in material terms. Privilege, white settler privilege, also has symbolic expressions, have non-material expressions, cultural expressions, and the superiority of a white settler is not founded on his or her ownership of the means of production. Because as Memmi says that, we have seen that a poor settler thinks and in actuality is superior to a rich black person. Now, Fanon does in that one sentence say that, colonial, or rather Marxism has to be stretched in order to help us understand the colonial situation. But I think that that's an inadequate way if we end it just there. Because it has led to very mechanical attempts at accommodating, the other, aspects of colonialism. You can see in people who assume that the economy is the primary cause of colonialism, they then integrate the other things as secondary to, the economic imperative. You can see, when people say they are Fanonian Marxists, that it is basically an attempt to say that, well, we recognize that, the motivations for colonialism, were economic. Fundamental reasons, it was, economic. But then in its expression, it came to assume a racial connotation. It's more or less like that, that very odd contraption that came out of South African revisionist school called racial capitalism. That's tautology. Capitalism is always racial anyway. In its nature, capitalism is racial. So when you say it's racial capitalism, you're being tautological. It's the same thing in a different way, in an opposite way, when people say that, well, they are, Marxist, Leninists of Fanonian, they try to bring this coupling. The point is, we are thinking about a real concrete situation. Let us think about it, informed by what is the concrete. In the concrete, there is an articulation all at once of several contradictions. So don't start from preconceived theoretical positions. The starting point must be the concrete. What is the concrete? What are, the articulations? What are the complex relations, that are expressing themselves? What are the complex interpellations, that are articulating themselves in any concrete situation? And then would be able, to think properly about decolonization. So, this is the second understanding of what colonialism is. The North African school was actually not to have as significant an influence in Africa in the 1960s when many African countries gained their independence. Because there is, once Africa gained its independence in the 1960s, there is actually a resurgence of the Marxian understanding of colonialism. In part because the Soviet Union had supported many liberation movements. And so many of those countries that had been supported in their struggle for liberation by the Soviet Union went Marxist-Leninist. Of course, they tried, to give these African, elements or quotations, African socialism, as Nyerere would call it, and Nkrumah would call it, but primarily this was Marxism as it had been brought to Africa from the Soviet Union. But there was something else. There was another development. It is that post-independence, many African countries, unlike South Africa, many African countries actually realized or acknowledged correctly that actually attainment of political independence opens the door to definitive liberation. Now, what is definitive liberation? Definitive liberation basically means that, as we say, political independence opens the door to definitive liberation, whose attainment, once you have attained, you do not have to ask what is black in it or what is African in it. Let us restate. Definitive liberation, which, happens precisely at the moment of political independence, means that once you have attained definitive liberation, you are not going to ask what is African or black in it. It basically is self-evident. What is black in it, or African in it is self-evident. Now, how did many African countries basically open this door of definitive liberation? It is that many of them took seriously the responsibility of developing their own intellectuals, their own indigenous intellectuals in large numbers. They developed a cadre of committed African intellectuals who were going to help them lead the struggle for definitive liberation. These were the people who were going to make their knowledges black so that you don't have to ask what is black in it. These were people who trained, other Africans, so that, you today walk, in many African societies, you do not have a history of the colonizer that is written by the colonized. Now, there's something odd in South Africa. Hopefully time will allow me to explain this, before I end. There's something odd in South Africa. You have a nationalist, an ANC government that says that history is going to be a compulsory subject. Who's going to write that history? Who are your historians? Where are they going to come from? Because I can tell you, I teach at the University of Cape Town. At the University of Cape Town History Department, there's only one black South African. In Stellenbosch, there is none. Free State, there is none. Wits, there is only one. UWC, there is only one. Professor or even not just professor, academic in the history department. So who are these historians that are going to write your history? It is because the imagination that I spoke of that is embarrassingly low of the nationalist elite that led South Africa and continues to lead South Africa today has led to a very shallow understanding of decolonization. But let's not be sidetracked. The point is that post-independence, most African countries created their own indigenous intellectuals. So in a moment, I'm going to talk about, Thandika Mkandawire's characterizations of 3 generations of African scholars. But at this point, what I want to suggest is that amongst the first generation of African scholars, okay, this won't work. I have to start from Thandika Mkandawire. So in 2005, or rather no, in 1995, Thandika Mkandawire, a Malawian scholar, publishes an article titled 3 Generations of African Scholars. In this article, Thandika Mkandawire, it's 1995, Thandika Mkandawire traces the history or writes the archaeology, so to say, of African intellectuals since 1960. He says that since 1960, African countries have produced 3 generations of African scholars. That is from 1960, count from 1960 to 1995 when he writes this article. 1960, so it's 70, 80, 90, 95, it's 35 years. So in 35 years, what Thandika Mkandawire, brings to our attention is that other African countries had produced 3 generations of African scholars. Now think of it. Here we are talking about relatively poor African countries compared to South Africa. But in 35 years, they had produced 3 generations of African scholars. In 35 years. South Africa has been independent for 25 years. How is it that it can't count a single generation of African scholars? Because it has none. None. Not a single generation of African scholars. Now, earlier on I said I have a difficulty talking about the measures that have been suggested as precautionary measures against, COVID or coronavirus. Anyone who's observant enough would see that all the experts that have commented on the coronavirus, whether as professors of epidemiology, whether as professors of infectious diseases, whether as professors of internal medicine, whether as professors of medicine generally, all of them have been anything but black. In a country where black people constitute 86% of the population. Now, this is what happens to a country that fails to take the very first step that follows political independence, which is creating your own intellectuals. Now, all of a sudden, the government is scrambling against that white professor, who says that your ideas were nonsensical. Of course, she had to do it because she has seen, and white people have seen, that you don't have your own intellectuals that are going to defend you as a black government. So this slander that, all the white academics have been passing, and their language has been consistent and common, irrational. Government's decisions are irrational, unscientific, because the supposition is that science, the domain of thought, the domain of high intellectual thought, is always a domain of white people. We enter that domain as objects to be studied. And so it's not coincidental that their language has always been to say you lack the reason and the rationality necessary to steer the country through this. We got to this point because I wanted to explain the fact that definitive liberation means creating your own intellectuals who are going to defend you as a black government, which is what South Africa has not done. In fact, not only, is basically, expertise in South Africa external to us as black people, even in our communities, it's always outside of our communities. You never find any of these black experts, being embedded in our communities. If you look at the reportage again of COVID-19, if we had our own black professors of public health, our own black professors of epidemiology, they would have said, wait a moment, WHO might have been correct in saying social distancing. But in South Africa, where we have a history of social distancing, apartheid was nothing but social distancing, because social distancing and physical distancing are two separate things. If we had our own black intellectuals as professors of public health, as professors of epidemiology, they would have said, wait a moment, that terminology in a country that is just emerging out of apartheid may not be appropriate here. But no one has done so because thought in South Africa remains white. So what has happened basically in South Africa is that white people have found a medical legitimation for what was otherwise a racial tendency. Anyone who's walked in a supermarket, and have seen white people walking far away from you previously, not wanting to come anywhere near you, would know that today they can do so without having to worry because it's called social distancing. Now, when you don't have your own intellectuals, that's how shallow your independence becomes. Now, we must not lose track. In the 1960s, there was the first generation of African scholars that were produced in the rest of the continent. And as we've said, Tandika says by 1995 there were 3 generations. I want to focus on the first generation because it was through this first generation, based largely in Dar es Salaam in Tanzania. It was through this generation that Marxism made a return to our understanding of decolonization in Africa. It was through this generation because it actually got its influence not so much from the Soviet Union, but from Latin America. So in Latin America, they had developed a school called the Dependency School, led by Andre Kunda Frank, which was basically a Marxist analysis, This dependency school had a much more, significant influence on this first generation of African scholars who thought, just like Hobson and Lenin, that colonialism was nothing but an economic project. Many of them, as I've said, were based in Dar es Salaam. They included African scholars, first generation of African scholars, but they had also people from all over the non-Western world. Perhaps the best expression of that school of thought is Walter Rodney, who himself was, at a point in Dar es Salaam and in Kenya, who wrote a book titled How Europe Underdeveloped Africa. But this first generation of African scholars included people like Mahmoud Mamdani, people like a Ugandan scholar called Den Nabudere, Nigerian political economist called Claude Ake, another Nigerian political scientist who turned, after leaving Dar es Salaam, who turned to the study of ethnicity, Okwadiba Noli. It included people like the South African anthropologist, Archie Mafeje, profound, Marxist anthropologist. It included people, even though not quite in Dar es Salaam, people like Bernard Makubane, who also wrote in that tradition. It included people like, Ibo Mandaza from Zimbabwe. Included people like Ahmed Babu from Tanzania. Included, people like, several other people. I mentioned those names because we must know that Africans have been thinking, So this first generation of African scholars returned us to an understanding of decolonization as nothing but an undoing of, the capitalist imperative. So it returned us to that understanding of colonialism as having been motivated to the last instance by profit. And so in the 60s, there was this dominance by this school of thought, that, thought of it in the same way. Now, but curiously, the school of thought, began to be challenged, but it also began to be challenged from within. It began to be challenged by another school of thought. So now we are on to, we began with Hobson, we came to the North African school, we came to the return of the Marxian via the Dar es Salaam school. Now we are on to into a fourth or a third in a sense, if you fuse, the two Marxian schools of decolonization. Now the other school that came to challenge, the Marxian school, or came to displace the Marxian school, came from Ibadan. It came from Nigeria in Ibadan, and it was championed basically by a Nigerian sociologist turned political scientist called Peter Eke. Peter Eke delivered an inaugural lecture at Ibadan in 1980 titled Colonialism, a Social Structure. Now, what was the new theorization that, Peter Eke gave to us of decolonization, which marks yet another moment in the history of the concept? Peter Eke said, colonialism, properly understood, is not the activities of the colonizers and the colonized and the responses of the colonized. He says that is colonization. The activities of the colonizers and the colonized responding to that, he says that's colonization. He says that it is much more than colonization. He says, well, maybe a much more useful way of thinking about it would come to us, via, a French anthropologist called social anthropologist called Georges Belandia. Georges Belandia had spoken of the colonial situation. He says that it is best to think about the colonial situation rather than colonization, because for Georges Belandia, being a social anthropologist that he was, colonization or colonialism is best understood at that moment of the encounter between the colonizer and the colonized. It's not these two separately, it's not these two clashing, but it is that encounter that arises, that moment of the encounter between the colonizer and the colonized, which has other elements other than conflict, the social elements, the cultural elements of it. So he calls this the colonial situation. Peter Eke says, well, this is useful way of thinking about colonization and decolonization, but it is inadequate. And he says a much more adequate of thinking about it is to think about colonialism as a social movement. Now he says that if you think of colonialism as a social movement, the term decolonization itself doesn't make sense, because according to him, there is never a break between colonialism and post-colonialism. If you think of colonialism as a social movement, what you have is a continuous, development of the phenomenon without a break. Now, but what is a social movement? He says that colonialism must be understood as a social, not just a social movement, but a world historical social movement. And in order to understand a world historical social movement, we must understand it in terms of the fact that its effects, the effects of any social movement, are supra-individual, meaning that they far outlive the time and space of their occurrence. Maybe it will help if we follow Peter Eke here and say that he says colonialism is comparable to two other world historical social movements. He says it is the Industrial Revolution, it is the French Revolution. These for him are the other two world historical social movements. What is common between colonialism, the Industrial Revolution, and the French Revolution? This is what characterizes all historical movements that are world historical or that are social movements of world historical scale. It is that, as we've said, their effects are supra-individual. They have enduring effects that are supra-individual that far outlive the time and space of their occurrence. Again, one of the other characteristics of all social movements is such that because they are supra-individual, they do not leave anyone with a choice as to whether they want to be affected by them or not. So they are supra-individual in such a sense that, well, you don't have an option of raising your hand and saying, please, can I not be affected by the Industrial Revolution? No. Or you don't have a choice of raising your hand and saying, well, as South Africa, can we not be affected by the effects of the French Revolution? No, because the French Revolution is what gave us the modern concept of democracy. So we are all affected by it. So Peter Eke says, colonialism is just like the other two social movements, which is the French Revolution and the Industrial Revolution, in the sense that they do not leave people with a choice whether to be affected or not. The other element of all social movements is that their enduring effects far outlive the time and space of their occurrence, meaning that we know that the Industrial Revolution happened in Europe, in England, way, before now, in the 16th century. But until today, its effects continue to be felt. Of course, there are some who say we are in the post-industrial era, but the post itself is predicated on the industrial era. It means that to understand the post-industrial era, you must understand the industrial era first. So there's a return of the industrial era, even at the moment when people think they have escaped the industrial era. So we can see that it happened in Europe way long before now, but it continues. Its effects continue to be felt today. It's the same thing with colonialism. It happened, from 1884 up until 1960, when many countries gained their independence, but its effects continue to be felt today. The third element of, social movements is such that they integrate societies that are affected into a world system. So the Industrial Revolution integrated, all societies into an industrial capitalist system. Colonialism also integrated us not just to the industrial capitalist system, but it also integrated us into a world historical situation or into a world historical system. Again, another element of, social movements is that all social movements, wherever they have happened, wherever the tidal wave of social movements has, passed, it leaves nothing as it was prior to its occurrence. There's nothing that remains as it was before. So it fundamentally transforms society such that there is nothing that remains as it was prior to the occurrence of the social movement. Indeed, wherever colonialism has been, nothing remains as it was. Today people try, to talk about traditional systems of rule. We now know that all of those things, there's nothing autochthonous about them. They were all affected by colonialism. You only have to look, to understand the point. You only have to look at, for instance, the king of Amazulu. Whenever he goes to officiate the coronation of any other chief, you must look at his paraphernalia and his staff of office. He wears a military-like, a jacket emboldened and decorated with, gold, and carries a gold sword. Now, those are all things taken from the British royal family. And then you say this is traditional form of authority. There is nothing, once a social movement has occurred, there is nothing that remains as it was prior to its occurrence. So that's another element of a social movement. And so Peter Eke's conclusion is that everywhere, if you're looking for colonialism, there is no break it continues. And so everywhere, according to Peter Eke, colonialism is characterized by three resultant social, structures. Three resultant social structures. He says that anywhere where colonialism has happened, you find these three structures. What are they? He says it is the migrated social structures. These social structures, are things like parliaments. These are things like, the universities. These institutions, according to him, they are often migrated wholesale from European societies into the colonial world. But he says that there is something they leave behind. As they come to the colonial world, they leave behind their moral underpinnings, but they also leave behind the capability to renew themselves. So they suffer from fixation. Now let's give an example that will be closer to those who've organized, this session. If you think about Parliament, now Parliament first emerges in the UK, or rather in England, where the nobility defeats the monarchy. Of course, because the nobility, wanted to distinguish itself, from the plebeians, the ordinary people, Parliament had to assume a certain, posture so that it became obvious that Parliament was the institution of the nobility. Indeed, it was the institution of the nobility. That's why people today say that it is an inherently bourgeois institution. I think that doesn't quite capture the point. The point is that it is the nobility, it's an institution of the nobility. But because the nobility needed to distinguish itself from the ordinary plebeians, the nobility also had in its dress, to maintain a certain outlook that would make it obvious that you belong to the class of the nobility. You were not of, the ordinary, laboring class. So today, people say, well, how can, those who organize this session, how can the EFF come to Parliament, wearing overalls? They do not ask, what is the purpose of Parliament? It is to make laws. Now, to make laws, you use your brain. It has nothing to do with what you're wearing. To make good laws, you need to apply yourself. But that obsession is as a result of fixation. Because you were given by the nobility this migrated social structure, you want to maintain it as the nobility had created it for itself. So suit wearing, in Parliament is a way of distinguishing the elite from, ordinary people. Now think of it. Medical doctors, have proven that, what you wear has nothing to do with what you do. Medical doctors dress anyhow. Does that make them less capable? No. But we are digressing. The point is, Peter Eke says that everywhere where colonialism has been, this tidal wave has been, it leaves behind three social structures. The migrated social structures, your parliaments, your universities, the military, and all of these come devoid of their moral underpinnings, but they're also devoid of the capability to renew themselves. They suffer from fixation. Two, he says that the second social structure is what he calls the transformed indigenous social structures. Of course, colonialism as a social movement meets in the continent existing structures, but it transforms them. They become what he calls transformed indigenous social structures. And the last element, the last category of social structures that he says you find in any colony is what he calls the emergent social structures. These ones emerge in order to fill the vacuum, to serve the functions that could not be served either by the migrated social structures or the emergent social structure, or rather the transformed indigenous social structures. And so you have the emergent social structures. And the example for him, of emergent social structures are things like ethnicity. So this is the third or fourth element, depending on how you count. This is the, fourth conceptualization of decolonization, for us. Now, this is where I'm going to end by asking, how adequate is this last conception? And perhaps from it, are we not able to develop our own conception today of what decolonization means? Now, there's something interesting here. It is that when the first generation of African scholars realized that Marxism was inadequate, as Mahmoud Mamdani says, in Citizen and Subject, he belongs to that first generation of African scholars who believed that, colonialism had been motivated by economic factors, who believed that market-based categories were the only categories that made sense in explaining the politics of African societies. But he says, we all in the 1980s found ourselves confused by conflict that was organized along, categories that did not emanate from the market. So we couldn't explain religious conflict. We couldn't explain ethnic divisions. We couldn't explain other forms of social cleavages that were not of the market. The best we could do is to say that there were evidence of, false consciousness. But that was not enough, he says they found out. So again, I want to follow, that spirit of self-critique and say that, well, Peter Eke is a very useful conceptualization, but here is what he misses. And in order to be able to drive home the point about what he misses is that we must begin by acknowledging that colonialism in Africa took two forms. There was on the one hand colonies of domination, and there was on the other colonies of settlement. Quickly, let's trace this distinction. So colonies of domination were those colonies that the colonizers were content with dominating politically. And colonies of domination basically were found mainly in West Africa. On the other hand, colonies of settlement or settler colonies were those colonies that the colonizers did not just dominate politically, but they turned them into their homes. They settled in them in large numbers. Of course, invited by several things, including the weather and, several other things. Colonies of domination, we said, were found mostly in West Africa. Colonies of settlement were found mostly in Southern Africa. South Africa, Angola, Mozambique, Namibia, Zimbabwe, parts of the East Coast, Tanzania, parts of Kenya. Colonies of domination, Nigeria, Ghana, Togo, Ivory Coast, Burkina Faso, and other countries in West Africa into Central Africa, gained their independence peacefully. Colonies of settlement gained their independence via armed liberation struggle. Colonies of domination gained their independence in the 1960s. Colonies of settlement were very late in gaining their independence, beginning with Angola, Mozambique in 1975, followed by Zimbabwe in 1980, followed by Namibia in 1989, and lastly South Africa in 1994. Colonies of settlement are thus faced by different challenges in the era of political independence, because unlike colonies of domination, in colonies of domination, the few colonial administrators, at independence, they simply packed their bags and they left. On the other hand, something very odd happens in colonies of settlement. It is that, and South Africa best exemplifies this, it is that in colonies of settlement, South Africa went to bed on the 26th of April 1994 with white people who knew themselves to be settlers and to be colonizers. South Africa went to bed on the 26th of April with black people who knew themselves to be the black colonized. But on the 27th of April, we woke up with yesterday's settlers and colonizers as citizens. Nothing else changed. Nothing else in colonial relations changed except their statutory position. It is that they were no longer colonizers, they were now citizens, entitled of the same rights and privileges with those that yesterday they colonized. Even more odd is that on the 27th of April, you had black people who knew very well that on the 26th of April, white people hated them, despised them. They sent their children to white people to educate them. But the point is, in order to be able to see the limitations of Peter Eke's characterization of decolonization, we have to distinguish between colonies of domination and colonies of settlement. But we also see that unlike colonies of domination, colonies of settlement, all of them are troubled by the problem of land. Whether it is South Africa, whether it is Namibia, whether it is Zimbabwe, whether it is Kenya, there is a problem of land where the settlers, the white settlers, control the better half of productive, fertile land to the exclusion of the black colonized. So all what characterizes settler colonies is that they're all afflicted by the problem of land, which is not the case in colonies of domination. Now that we have made that distinction, here is the simple limitation of Peter Eke's. Peter Eke has a sociological imagination, but it is a very structured and formal sociological imagination. He says the three major social movements of the modern period are the Industrial Revolution, French Revolution, and colonialism. Because he has a very formal structural sociological imagination, he's unable to see the much more diffused structures or social movements that are as epochal or that are as world historical as the other three he mentions. So he's unable to see that just as colonialism was happening, there was another social movement, slavery. But also, just as he fails to recognize that the other major social movement in the modern period was slavery, he's unable or he fails to recognize that racism was another social movement. So racism and slavery do precisely the same thing that social movements do. Now, once we are able to recognize, which Peter Eke is unable to do, now the reason is simple. Peter Eke is Nigerian. He writes from a colony of domination. So he doesn't have an understanding of racial relations, which are a feature of settler colonialism. This is why today, again, there is a very nonsensical and, a very ignorant supposition that because we were all colonized, we all understand colonialism. You have seen that people who come from colonies of domination don't understand the colonial nature of race relations. Or I've heard people express frustration, for instance, about fellow Africans who come from West Africa, that they do not have an understanding of racial relations. They don't. But you see, the problem is that you have assumed that because we all were colonized, we all have the same understanding of colonialism. So we must accept that colonialism manifested itself differently. It might have had its overarching assumptions, white superiority, black inferiority, but the concrete. Remember, if we begin from the concrete, we are able to see what is the constellation of factors that get articulated in a complex. And so, if you begin from the concrete, you see this distinction, but you also see that racism, just like slavery, constitutes a social movement that Peter Eke was not able to recognize. And so, our conception of decolonization has not been able to accommodate these other social movements that are less formal, like racism, like slavery. Because then, when we begin to undo the colonial relations, we must recognize the fact that colonialism exceeds the return of the land. Very important, necessary but not sufficient condition for decolonization. The return of the economy, necessary but not sufficient for decolonization. Undoing the nature of sexual relations between a white gaze that sees the black as a sexual object, very necessary but not sufficient. So we must return to the point we began with, that neither Marxism nor psychoanalysis should preempt other explanations of colonialism, just as it is that we must cease from beginning our thinking from preconceived ideas and begin from the concrete. I think in part this is why you would notice that I've said very little about the decolonial school that has come to us from Latin America via Latin American scholars. I think that our understanding of colonialism and decolonization in South Africa, once that school ceases to be fashionable, we're going to be very poorer for it because we have not taken the concrete as our beginning of thought. I thank you very much.